so far in this section of Mark, we've had this lingering question of who Jesus is kind of hanging over this. As they crossed the Sea of Galilee and the disciples were in fear of their life, and they woke up Jesus and he stopped the storm, they asked a question: who is this guy? What manner of man is this? Not just, it almost rings deeper than just who is this, but what is he? This is not what we were expecting. They were terrified. And since that question was asked on the sea, it has hung over the rest of this story. We saw that answer was partly answered as Jesus encountered the demon-possessed man and the Gerasenes, and the people were terrified. But we saw an answer to that question: who is this man? This is a man, this is the God-man, who can stand toe-to-toe, outnumbered thousands to one against the spiritual forces of darkness, and still dispel them with a single word, the same as he calmed that sea. We saw again repeated that the people were terrified. That coming face to face with the Holy One is a terrifying thing. And we see people's response to this. The disciples were afraid. The people in Gennesaret, they were terrified. And they said, "Get out of here, Jesus. Leave, because we don't want you here. You scare us. And so we're asking you to leave." And we're going to continue that as we look at this question still hanging over: who is this man, Jesus? And we're going to see how we respond to this. So far we've seen a lot of responses to Jesus. We're going to see what does it look like to come to this man as he's further defined, but also what does it mean to come to him in faith? What does faith in him look like? So far, people have been recoiling in fear. The disciples are terrified. The people in Gennesaret, they're terrified. Get out of here. And that's going to shift as we see people actually go from there to approaching Jesus despite their fear, approaching him. And we're going to look at what that means to approach him in faith like that, approaching him in this dear faith that these people have. Remembering that central question as we look at this as it unfolds throughout the rest of Mark chapter 5 in verses 21 through 43. It's a long section. It's going to be daunting. I know usually we kind of have done smaller sections, but it all flows as one narrative. This section here, you might know this well. This is the healing of Jairus' daughter, which is a story that is intermingled with the story of the woman who is healed from her discharge of blood. And it's this kind of story is intertwined together. In all three gospel accounts, it's intertwined together, which tells us that something about these two stories are intertwined. And so I didn't want to break them apart because Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell the story intertwined together. It would make sense if we could separate these stories, that maybe one of these authors would have separated it, because it reads better as a separated story. Right? This happened, and this happened. But all three gospel writers tell it like this, where the story is interrupted and then continues. So as we open to Mark chapter 5, I invite you to join me in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your word this morning. Father, we thank you for bringing us together to hear it. Father, I pray that you would give me the words to speak this morning to your people. Father, that you would open our hearts and our minds to receive your truth from your word. That you would fill the words spoken from this platform with your Holy Spirit and power. Father, that you be your truth that goes forth for the building up and the edification of your people, of your church this morning. Draw us closer to you, be honored and glorified as we open your word. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I invite you to join me in Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 21. There we read, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live.' And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garments. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except for Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. Jesus saw a commotion, people wailing, weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making such a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know of this, and told them to give her something to eat. In this story where we learn further of who Jesus is, we see the people's faith in him, that he is this great physician. But we see as they come to him in faith, we see this desperate faith, we see audacious faith, we see fearless faith. We see that we can come to Jesus with our needs. Our faith doesn't have to be huge or perfect. But if our faith is in Jesus, he will receive us in our faith. And Mark, as he usually does, sets this up by the setting. He tells us that we're back in Galilee. We've seen them go from Capernaum. They sailed across the sea to the area of Gennesaret, where we talked about how that was modern-day Kursi on the eastern shore in the area of the Decapolis. And now they have returned back, most likely to Capernaum, we're not told. But as they land, the crowds come almost immediately, and it was in Capernaum that the crowds were so great that Jesus had to have an escape boat at the ready, because they were pressing in so much that, as we were told in Mark 3:20, that they couldn't even eat, that the crowds were pressing in so far, so close that they couldn't eat. They're so thick in Mark 4 that they said they had the escape boat, that as he went off, he had to preach from the boat because the crowds were pressing in so much. And so as he lands back on the other side of the sea, we're told, the crowds come again. So it's most likely in Capernaum. And you can just imagine as they're coming in, that boat's coming in, and everyone's out on that shoreline. They're mending their nets. They're checking in. They see a boat coming in, and they're like, "Who's that?" Because everyone's already in for the day. And they see this boat coming in there. And like, "Oh, is that? Oh, hey, there's that Jesus. Hey, go send word that Jesus is here." You see some little kid running in town. "Jesus is here. Jesus is here." And as soon as they're done landing the boat, the crowds are already pressing in on him, as we see. And in the middle of that crowd, we see a man who we wouldn't expect to see. We see Jairus. And remember, we have Galilee here. There's Gergesa on the eastern shore, Capernaum up there. And so we have these kind of three places here. Capernaum is where he taught in parables. We had in the middle of the sea, the calming of the sea. And then on the other side of the shore there, we had the deliverance of the demon-possessed man. And now they've essentially gone right back across that sea. Being that we're not told, I'm assuming it was a much calmer sailing trip this time around. So they got across the sea this time without any commotion. And upon their arriving, the crowds are there. And we're told in Mark's lovely way that immediately they met him, these crowds, and that immediately Jairus comes. And this is right off the bat, Jairus by name. He's a ruler of the synagogue, we're told. This is not an official title. This is not like a clerical role. This would be somewhere between a deacon and a trustee. Somewhere between, so he would be, a ruler of the synagogue would be someone who would be there to make sure that the building was kept up, to make sure that there were the elements necessary for worship, that the lamps were trimmed and they had the oil, that the Torah scroll was kept in nice shape, make sure that, if the stone started cracking in the pavement, that he would replace it, but also if someone needed to get called on because they were sick, go spread word, kind of let people know about things. And so it's not a clerical position. He's not a rabbi or anything like that, but he's still an important man. And he would probably be kind of half funding the synagogue. He might even have a bench in the synagogue with his name on it. This is Jairus' bench. Thankful for his donation, for his wonderful contribution. That is Jairus' bench in the synagogue. And so he would be a man of some note. And so we wouldn't expect him to come to Jesus, because from Mark 3:6 onward, we saw that the leaders, the Pharisees, and the other religious leaders, including men like Jairus, were scheming to destroy Jesus. And so it's a shock that in the middle of this crowd, this man named Jairus, this upstanding religious leader, comes to Jesus and ask for help. And you can hear the desperation in his plea. He's desperate for help. He's so desperate. It's not just that his daughter is sick. Literally, it says in the Greek that she is at her eschatos. Maybe you've heard of eschatology, study of end times. This girl is at her end. It's not just that she's sick. She is at her end. Her existence has reached its end. That's how it's worded here. She has reached her very end. Not just that she's sick. It's not even that she's heading towards death, but she's literally dying right now. So he's coming to Jesus. Literally, Jesus, my daughter is at her end. She's literally in her death throes. I've been by the side of people who are dying, and that you get those last breaths as they rattle, and oftentimes lungs start filling with fluid, and it's horrible to be there, as you just want them there to find some peace. And Jesus is coming there, and he's saying, my daughter is at that point. She is in her she's at this death throes. She is in her end, Jesus. And despite the religious tension, despite who Jesus is and who he's shown himself to be, and despite who Jairus is, a religious leader, he doesn't care. Luke adds, in Luke 8:42, that this is his only child. I mean, I have 5, so I've got some to spare. So I don't know what it would be like, but you can imagine this is his only child. And his only child is dying. Not just that she got a bad prognosis, she's actively dying right now. Jesus, please come. Mark wants us to hear the desperation in this plea. He's so desperate, he doesn't care about any decorum. He doesn't care about the tensions. He wants help. And there's no place else for him to turn. And so he begs. He joins the whole crowd of people who are begging. We saw last week as we were in the Gerasenes there, and the people there, we saw all this begging. Right? The demons begged Jesus, don't destroy us. The people begged Jesus after to get out. And the man begged Jesus, please take me with you. And now Jesus has reached the other side of the shore, and this Jairus is begging Jesus. Same word in the Greek. He's begging him, please, Jesus, I need you. I need what you can do. He begs. And so Jesus answers. Jairus' faith is small, right? He's not maybe trusting in much. We know that later on in Jesus' ministry, a centurion will say, Jesus, my servant is dying. If you just say the word, he'll be fine. Jairus isn't quite there yet. Jairus is saying, I need you to come. Because that's what he's seen. Jesus has laid hands on people. So he says, Jesus, come, lay your hands on my daughter. Come and heal her. But it's a genuine faith. He has heard the tales, and he's willing to go out of his way because he believes that Jesus can help. And so we see in Jesus' faith, Jairus' faith, that he comes to Jesus. Or we see these elements of faith. He comes to Jesus. And he does it humbly. He falls at Jesus' feet. He's open and honest, and he says, Jesus, this is my situation, and I need you. He doesn't hold anything back. He pours his heart out at Jesus' feet. I need you, Jesus. And he has confidence in the power and the goodness of Jesus, that if you come, I know she could be made well. He trusts in Jesus' power. He trusts in the goodness of Jesus. Jesus, I know you want to help. Please come help. And so we see Jairus' faith. It's a desperate faith, but it's a genuine faith. It's a heartfelt faith. And Jesus responds to this genuine, heartfelt, but desperate faith with, okay, and he goes with him. And in the middle of this story, like I said, this story gets interrupted in every account, because it's at this point that there's this interruption. And when you read the story, it's like, well, why would you write a story this way? I mean, some of the events in Mark and Matthew and Luke, you read these, sometimes they move events around a little bit in their accounting of it to try to tie with whatever theme that they're trying to lay out. In the ancient historical methods, telling a true story wasn't so much about telling the story exactly as it happened, so much as just making sure that as long as the details are right, you can rearrange them a little bit to make whatever point you're trying to make. But yet in all three of the synoptic gospels that this account shows into, none of the authors rearranged it. And so all of them thought that this story needs to be told like this. And so when Jesus says, okay, to Jairus' desperate faith, they head off. And as they're heading off, there's an interruption. This interruption comes in, and you can just imagine Jairus is like, we ain't got time for this. I need you now. But the crowd presses in, they're following along, and Jesus just stops. You figure for everybody else in the audience, Jesus just stops and says, who touched me? Now we are given a little backstory before there, but for everybody else who was there, they're just going in the massive crowd is thronging around Jesus, and in the middle of this thronging crowd, Jesus just says, hold up, who touched me? And so you can see that they're just like, what? Jesus, what? But we're given this backstory, and as we look at this backstory, we can see that this woman's story starts with the urgency. We know the urgency of Jairus. Right? Jairus is desperate. You can imagine the fear, the dread, the panic, and now add to that frustration, because he wants to my daughter is actively dying right this second. I need you, Jesus. And then there's this interruption. And so to understand this woman's story, we start with this urgency, that in the midst of this story, we have this urgent story that's going forward, and yet everything gets put on pause. And then there's the uncleanness. In order to understand where this woman is coming from, you have to understand her uncleanness. Leviticus 15:25 tells us that if a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of her discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. Numbers 5:2 goes so far to lump women in this condition in with lepers. And might be, if we rewind back to when we saw Jesus cleansing the lepers were considered essentially the walking dead. They couldn't touch anybody. They can't be near anybody. They're cut off from everyone. They're cut off from society. They have to go around wearing rags, yelling out unclean. They can't touch anyone. They can't get near anyone. They can't talk to anyone. They are essentially cut off, and they aren't dead yet, but they might as well be. And Numbers 5:2 tells us that the command the people of Israel to put out of the camp everyone who is leprous or has a discharge. or has come in contact with the dead. And so these three groups of people, they're outside the camp. So this woman with her issue, she's outside the camp. She's been set aside. She might as well be a leper, according to the law. And not only is she unclean, not only is she set aside, we're not told of her problem. The language in this passage makes it clear that it is a gynecological issue. I have some interesting search history. It's probably an issue called menorrhagia, which is an ongoing discharge. And so this is probably what she had. And ancient medicine was not up to the task. Even today, trying to discern how this is happening and how best to treat it would take time and lots of tests. And back in these days, they don't have lab tests, they don't have CAT scans, they don't have any of the things that we would do. So medicine is mostly about finding some herbs that maybe lessen pain, and maybe finding something to lessen some of the symptoms, but there's really nothing they could do. But we're told that over the course of 12 whole years, this woman has tried. She's desperate. Like I said, she's cut off from everyone. And so she's desperate to have her life back. If she has a husband, her husband probably left her. In the law, such a person like this there would have been, not so much in the law, but in the rabbinic interpretation of the law, it would have been perfectly justified for a husband to divorce his wife under this. Because she's been rendered unclean, and there's no end in sight for that. So what is a husband to do? He can't be married to such a person because she's outside the camp. She's gone. She's outside. She's cut off. And so to move on with his life would have to divorce her and move on. And so if she ever had a husband, she doesn't now. Her family, friends, everyone, she's cut off. And so we see that she's desperate, and we see this desperation as we're told that she suffered under many doctors. And you see this language here that she suffered much under many physicians. You kind of have these double superlatives. She suffered a lot under a lot of doctors. Mark wants you to understand her situation here. She is so desperate, just like Jairus, she's desperate for a solution to her problem. And in her desperation, she has not only cut herself off, but now she's penniless. She has spent all that she had on trying to get treatments. And Mark isn't kind of digging against doctors. Just at the time, the medicine wasn't there. They didn't know what to do. And so we see in her this unwavering faith, this audacious faith. Audacious is a big word. Maybe I've been told many times that I use words that I need to not use. But audacious means bold, daring, brash, maybe even presumptuous, almost bordering on disrespectful. Your kids are pretty audacious. If you've got young kids, I want this. Okay, well, isn't it nice to want, right? That's the kind of audacious thing that we see in our children. And so her faith is like that. She's desperate. She's hopeless. But in the midst of her hopelessness, in the midst of her desperation, she has a faith that says, maybe, just maybe, I can sneak a blessing. That's the audacity here. Maybe I can sneak a blessing. Maybe I can sneak a healing. Maybe I don't have to go and make a big deal about things. Maybe I can, if I just touch his garment. And there's biblical precedent for that. In Micah 5:2, we're told there that the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in his wings. And this is a messianic prophecy. And this idea would come from something called a talit. They wore robes, and on the corners of their robes, they would have tassels. And so the shawl, this is a prayer shawl. Maybe you've seen a Jewish prayer shawl. And so we have the prayer shawl, and on the corners of this prayer shawl, you have what are called tzitzit. I told you I'd tell you about it at Sunday school. People who were at Sunday school with me. This is called the tzitzit. And this prayer shawl, they're told in the law to make for themselves tzitzit on the corners of their garments. And so the word for corner is wings. And in Numbers, where we're told in Numbers 15:38 that the word wings is for corners. So it kind of resembles a wing, right? The corner of your garment. And so upon the wings, you're supposed to attach the tzitzit. And this woman, we're told in the parallel accounts in Luke 8:44 and in Matthew 9:20, that this woman wanted to touch specifically the fringe of his garment. She wanted to touch his tzitzit because she remembered this promise of the Son of Righteousness who would have healing in his wings. And so she says, if I can touch the tzitzit, then maybe I can be healed. Because that prophecy from Malachi said that there would be healing in the wings of his garment. That on his tzitzit would come healing. And so I can touch that and I can get a healing. And this would go so far as Mark, Deuteronomy and Numbers makes tassels on the four corners of your garments on which you cover yourself. And there's a picture of it there. If you can't see it here, there's a man wearing one there. When they pray or read the Bible, they cover their heads. And so you can see the corners, the knots there. The knots are specific. There's 5 big knots for the 5 books of Moses. And you wrap it so many times, and between the wrappings and the knots, it represents the 5 books of Moses and the 613 laws of the Torah. And so even today, Hasidic Jews wear a version of this underneath their clothing that still has the tassels on the corners. The garment is called a talit. The special knots are called tzitzit. And so she says, maybe if I just touch the fringe of his garment. And we know this goes around in Mark 6:46. So fast forward to Mark 6. That whenever he came into the villages or the countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces, implored him that they might touch the fringe of his garment. So this story of this woman and this tie into Malachi goes out so that people are saying, let us touch your tzitzit, because the Son of Righteousness has healing in his wings. Let us touch the tzitzit. And they do, and they're healed. And we see that happen here too. We see her bold faith, that she's desperate just like Jairus. She is desperate for healing. She's desperate for healing. Jairus was desperate for healing. One comes publicly, the other one comes privately. But they're both desperate for Jesus' special touch. And so they both come to Jesus in their desperation and in their faith. They both believe that Jesus will and can heal them. And this goes back to that, echoing that question, who is this Jesus? This Jesus is the one who can heal, who will heal, who's good to heal. And so Jairus comes publicly, she comes privately, but at the end of it all, they both are touching they're both coming to Jesus' feet, and they're both reaching out for that healing. And she shouldn't even be in the crowd. She shouldn't be in the crowd. To be in the crowd, she's potentially rendering everyone unclean, but she doesn't care. That's that audacity. She doesn't, I want my healing, please. I know he can heal me. That's her desperation. And then Jesus, like I said, he turns around and says, who touched me? Now she wanted to keep things private, as you can imagine. This is an illness of a personal nature. You can understand why she'd want to keep this private. So she says, I'll sneak and I'll get my healing, and we can keep this between us. But Jesus stops the whole procession and says, who touched me? And you just know that the disciples are taking this opportunity. Jesus rebuked them on the boat, right? He's rebuked them before, and they're like, we're going to rebuke him now. What do you mean, who touched you, Jesus? There's a whole throng of people around you. That is a really dumb thing to say, Jesus. And that they think, yeah, we got him this time. But Jesus knows what's going on. He doesn't even address what they say, if you notice. He just goes right on and says he knows who did it, and he's looking for her. And as he's looking for her, she comes forward. She comes forward, and she tells him exactly what happens. And she tells the whole story. And in doing so, she gets far more than a healing. Jesus publicly restores her. So we might ask, well, why didn't Jesus just let this lady go home with her healing? Because she'd still be unclean. No one would know she was healed unless she wants to advertise that. You guys, hey, you know that really personal thing that I had an issue with? Now I don't have that issue anymore. And are people just going to take her word for it? No one's going to check. And so Jesus confronts her so that she can be fully restored. Jesus says to her that you have been made whole, and he calls her daughter. This is the only place in all the gospel accounts, it shows up in all three accounts of this story, but this is the only place in the gospel accounts that Jesus addresses somebody as daughter. And so he says to this woman, daughter. So she doesn't just get a healing, she's brought into the family. We talk about that, this adoption that we have. She's brought into the family. Daughter, you who were once outcast, you who were desperate, you who were unclean, now I call you daughter, and I give you shalom. I give you peace. Not only is she restored in her body, but she's restored in her soul. She is made whole, and she's declared his daughter. Not because there's some magic in a tzitzit. Jesus says, it is your faith that has made you well. It is your faith that has made you well. Because you believed in who I am and what I could do, you are now whole. You are now my daughter. You are now restored. And so Jesus calls her out on this, telling her that her faith has made her well. I don't know what I just did there. Oh, there we go. Apparently that does that, but sometimes that can happen. We see in her faith, even though she's bold, even though there's audacity in there, she's humble, like Jairus. She knows her need, and she knows that Jesus is the only one who can help her. And she's willing to humble herself so that when she's called out and Jesus says, who touches me, with great humility and fear, she falls down at his feet and she tells him the whole story. She gives an open and full confession of her story. Even though she didn't want to, even though it was uncomfortable, probably not just for her, but probably for a lot of people around there. I don't want to hear about this. But she gives the full confession before Jesus. And she tells of her boldness before Jesus. And then we're brought back to Jairus. But we see this contrast between them, right? They both of them, this comparison and contrast between the two of them, they both knew that only Jesus could help them. They both knew that they were unworthy of this help. They both fell down at Jesus' feet, and they both believed that Jesus could heal. And so we come back to Jairus, and Jairus in the middle of all this, you can just imagine that Jairus is not happy with this. This whole scene probably took only a couple minutes. But Jairus, remember that urgency we talked about. His daughter's actively dying. I need you, Jesus. I need you right now. And this whole thing stopped, and he's just like, oh, come on. Let's get a move on. My daughter's dying. Come on. Jesus, don't you care? You can imagine this ringing back to the boat scene, right? Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing? Jairus is, come on, Jesus. I told you my daughter's dying. This woman's been suffering for 12 years. She can wait. They all gather around. They're all pressing in there. And yet this message comes in the middle of that. This messenger says, don't bother. Don't bother the teacher anymore. It's too late. It's too late. It almost reminds me of Job when Job gets this news, because we're told while he's still speaking, the bad messengers come. In Job, if you've read through the first parts of Job there, Job gets the news that the building collapsed and killed all his children. And while that messenger is still speaking, the next guy shows up and says, hey, Job, all your camels were destroyed too. And then while he's still speaking, another guy shows up and says, hey, all your cattle are gone too. And the next guy shows up and says, all this is gone too. And we have that here where Jesus is saying, daughter, I gave you peace. Your faith has made you well. Go in shalom. And while he's saying that, they're saying, yeah, don't bother Jesus. It's too late. That's what we're told. Jesus overhears that. So he's pronouncing peace, and in the midst of pronouncing peace, he overhears this message, don't bother the teacher anymore. It's too late. And he turns to Jairus and says, do not fear, only believe. It's as if Jesus was saying to him, Jairus, I know what they said. I know that you're devastated, but it is not too late, despite what they told you. Do not be afraid. Do not give in to the terror. Trust in me. This isn't over. I know what I'm doing. You saw me just heal this woman. You've heard the stories. Don't fear. Just believe. That's hard though, isn't it? I don't want to just believe. I want to be afraid. I want to be angry. I want to be frustrated. We want to do so many other things besides just believe. But Jesus says, don't fear. Just believe. Only believe. Just do that. Only believe. Trust in him. And so we see Jairus' faith, because they continue on. And as they approach the house, we see there's mourners. This was a common practice. Right? We don't do that today too much, but still in Jewish culture they do this. You hire mourners. It was said in the Talmud, in the Mishnah rather, that by Rabbi Judah, that even the poorest in Israel should hire not less than 2 flutes, 2 flutists, and 1 wailing woman. So even if you're the poorest, you should hire at least 2 people to play the flute and have 1 wailing woman. Because the whole point is to say, while you're devastated, maybe you can't wail. Maybe you're just tired and you can't wail. So you pay someone else to do it for you. So that way everybody knows that somebody has died in this house. So they stand outside the house wailing, oh, and making a lot of commotion. And so Jesus comes into this commotion and he tells them, what are you doing? She's not dead, she's only sleeping. And of course, they laugh at him and they say, Jesus, you're off your rocker. We know a dead body when we see one. They wouldn't hire us to wail and to mourn if they thought she might have been dead. They're desperate. This is their daughter. They would make sure she was dead before they hired wailers. Right? Don't tell us that she's only sleeping. You're crazy. So they mock him. And of course, Jesus knows this isn't saying that she's not really dead, but he knows what he's going to go do. And so we see him as he takes Peter, James, and John to face even the face of open mockery as they laugh at him. He takes the 3, and taking the 3 is important because in the law, in Deuteronomy 19:15, that everything has to be confirmed, as it says in Deuteronomy 19:15, only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses can anything be attested to. And so him taking Peter, James, and John is not just because they're the inner circle. And I've wondered sometimes about them being the inner circle, if they're actually the inner circle or they're just the ones that Jesus can't trust to be alone. And so he takes Peter, James, and John. I need some witnesses to this. Right? Mark's testimony is from Peter. And so Peter's right there. Peter is there with James and John, and they go into the room, and they see what happens. Jesus dismisses the mourners. They laugh at him, and he shows them exactly who he is. Remember that question's hanging over all of this. Who is this? This is the one who can not only heal an issue of blood that's been hanging on for 12 years. This is the one who can speak to sea and wind the one who can stand outnumbered thousands to one against spiritual forces of darkness, the one who can heal. But this is the one who has power and authority over death itself. No one has seen this. This changes Jesus' ministry. This is like this exponential increase in what they've seen. Just like the calming of the sea was something that they couldn't even wrap their heads around, this changes everything. Jesus takes this girl by the hand. Again, we see Jesus breaking these taboos. The unclean woman touched Jesus' garment. Right? The demon came up to Jesus and knelt at his feet. The lepers came and begged at Jesus. Jesus is all about breaking these kind of cultural taboos. Because touching the dead might make one unclean, but Jesus cannot be made unclean. He is the untarnishable. And so in that transaction, where normally uncleanness spreads to uncleanness, so if I was unclean and I touch you, now you're unclean, and I touch you, and then you touch somebody else, and now they're unclean, you touch somebody else, now they're unclean, and it spreads. Jesus is the exact opposite. The unclean touches him, it becomes clean, because he cannot be made unclean. That's why that woman could touch him and be healed. Not only because he had healing his wings, but he cannot be rendered unclean, so something's got to give. And so he takes this woman, this little girl, by the hand. She's dead. He shouldn't touch a corpse. He doesn't care. He touches her. And we see this contact. And Mark gets lost in the moment. You can picture this as he gets lost in this moment. And he says, Mark forgets his language for a moment. And he said, Talitha Kumi. And he knows for a second that his audience is like, what now? Oh, that's why he translated. Oh, that is to say, little girl, get up. He has to translate it because he got lost in the moment. He's swept up in this passion of this moment because this is mind-blowing. This is a life-changing event. And Peter is telling this thing to Mark, and Mark's writing it down. You just picture Peter is getting worked up, and Mark's getting worked up, and he's saying, he took her by the hand. He took her by the hand, and he said, Talitha Kumi. And Mark's probably like, what's that again? Little girl, get up. It's only Mark that records that little note there of the Talitha Kumi. Again, that he's given this personal account of these stories. And so Jesus speaks to the dead. Why would he speak to the dead? Dead people can't hear. Because Jesus is God. This again answers that question. Who is this? Who is this man? This is the God-man. He can speak to the dead. As Romans 4:17 says, that God gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. He speaks to that which is not as though it is. And so Jesus speaks to this girl as though she's alive, and she is alive. Because he is God in the flesh. He is God of nature, the one who created wind and sea and storm. So he can speak to that storm and say, cease. And he can go from the raging torrent to a glassy sea. He is God of all creation, of heaven and earth, and everything in between. So he can stand toe-to-toe with Legion and say, get out. And Legion can't do anything to stop him. He's the God of life itself, so that he can speak to the dead, and the dead will arise. We see him do the same thing in John 11 as he calls out to Lazarus, Lazarus, come forth. And we're even given this little detail of him telling her to eat. Dying probably takes a lot out of you. And so he says, give her some food. She's been sick probably for a while. She hasn't eaten anything. Now she's alive. She's not a phantom. It's not a hallucination. Go get her some food. Go get her some food. And so we see in this story that he is worthy of the faith that he calls us to have. He calls us to say, trust in me. Have faith in me. And we see in this last kind of account of these unsavable people, these kind of hopeless cases. A raging sea. Who can stop a raging sea? Nobody but Jesus. Legion with his thousands of demons, and his life is forfeit. Who can save him? Jesus. The woman with 12 years of an issue that nobody could stop. Who can? Jesus. A dead girl. Who can? Obviously beyond help. She's dead. Jesus. He can help the helpless and the hopeless. And we see in this story so many parallels. We can see why these stories are woven together. Jairus had 12 years of sunshine with his only daughter that were about to be extinguished. The woman had 12 years of agony that was hopeless to heal. Jairus was an important man, a ruler of a synagogue. The woman was no one. We don't even know her name. Jairus was wealthy, and nothing else, he was important. The woman was poor. She had spent everything that she had. Jairus came publicly, approaching Jesus on the shore. The woman came secretly to sneak something. Jesus responded to the woman immediately. She touched him and he says, "Hey, who touched me?" And he tells Jairus to wait. Jairus' daughter was healed secretly while the woman was healed publicly. So we kind of have a reversal there. Jairus came publicly, and his healing that he got was private. The woman came secretly, but her healing was made public. And so we see these two stories linked together in each account of the Gospels because it happened like this. And they're tied together to show us what faith looks like. What does faith look like? Faith looks like coming to Jesus, like Jairus, like this woman, coming to Jesus in faith and who he is and what he can do and in his goodness. Whether you come boldly or you come meekly, come. Whether you come publicly or privately, come. Whether you come because it's something you don't even want to talk about, or you're so desperate you'll tell everybody about it in front of everyone because you don't even care. Come. Come in faith in the one who can help, the only one who can help. The great physician, the Lord of life, the one who has pure power to still a sea, unmatched authority to command the legion, unparalleled supremacy to not only heal the unhealable, but to turn back death itself. This is what we're told in this story. This is a story of grace shown to the most unworthy, to the most lost. Trust in Jesus. Come in faith. If you already know Jesus and you have faith, then bolster that faith in the knowledge that God is good, that he is there, and that if you come to him, regardless of how weak or strong your faith is, he is there to comfort and to heal and to answer. And if you don't know Jesus as Savior, then know that you can come to him today, regardless of where you've come from or who you are, and he too will bring you shalom, bring you peace. Join me as we close in prayer.